embrace. I want to give you 5 new traits about millennials. They are hopeful traits. They are wonderful traits, even though some of them can be very painful, and they are painful. But I want to hold up that if we can embrace as the church, if we can embrace these traits, amazing things will happen. After tea, I will go deeper into these traits, so I'm not going to go extremely deep, and then hopefully we'll have time yet to have some conversation before we have tea. But the first trait that is true for all millennials in the US, and my guess is here too, is that millennials know anxiety, uncertainty, loss, and trauma intimately. The average age for a child in the US today to have his, her, theirs first sexual experience is age 12. You cannot have your first sexual experience at age 12 and that be a good experience. It's just not possible. So just that alone implies an awful lot of young people who are walking around with the bruises of sexuality. The image that I have is this. So right there in Genesis, translations will say, you were made of the dust of the earth, yes? It's the absolute saddest translation we can have. The real translation is, you were made of the Adamah, the topsoil, the most fertile soil. That's what you were made of. If we think of dust, we should just wipe it away, shouldn't we? Who wants a dusty house? If you think of topsoil, that you and I were made of topsoil, that changes the image a little bit, doesn't it? But now, if the sexual experience that people have comes at age 12, basically you can see footprints and fingerprints on these bodies that were made of topsoil. And they won't be kind indentations. It's people who hold on for too long, who touch where they shouldn't have touched. Maybe the hand came as a fist. That is just one trait. If you look at a statistic such as date rape in the US, it's now a third under the age of 18 will experience date rape. As the dad of 2 teenage girls, I'm concerned. How on earth am I going to protect them from another guy who's about their age? But then if I ask you a question, when was the first time that you experienced somebody close to you who committed suicide? First of all, it'll be a handful of us maybe who can say that. And then I have to think really deep. I think I was in my upper 20s before somebody committed suicide close to me. You have kids as young as 9 who commit suicide in the US, which means all their classmates have been exposed to suicide. So this is my challenge to you. If you want to reach out to the millennial generation, you have to be able and comfortable enough to enter into the pain that's in their lives. And I am going to suggest, and I'll say this again, especially in our second session, that the entry point into a person's life is around that loss and trauma. That's where you begin. everybody shares that narrative. Everybody does. A second trait that millennials bring is that millennials are masters at building alternative communities. They are extremely good at that. Why? In part because they're savvy with social media and a bunch of other things. Technology comes in. But for Jules, for instance, with his recipe exchange ministry, he has built a following. He actually told me that he has people who will come to him and say, I have a second recipe that's a favorite of mine that I would like to share. But he's got such a list of people that he's still doing one at a time. Every week there's different people coming in. If it is true that millennials are building alternative communities, and in the next session I will unpack that a little bit more for us, then the logic step for you and me as church would be join them where they are meeting already. It is not, how can we get them to come to church? That is the wrong perception. If they are meeting already somewhere, and trust me they are, find out where that would be. Join them. Since I'm coming back to it, and I'll give you more examples, I'm just going to go to the next one, okay? Millennials have broken this belief that we have always had the last 25 years or so, that you can be spiritual but not religious. Millennials are deeply spiritual, even when they rarely come to church. And I will show you narratives in the next session that shows that most millennials worship in one way or the other. They are deeply, deeply spiritual. I teach a class on play. The title of the class is Play, Subversion, and Change. That's the title of the course. And we look at how you can use play theory to subvert power structures, especially, and how you can use play theory to bring social change. That's what the class is all about. I teach the class typically in the spring semester, which for us begins in January. So I walk into the class this past January, and Anna walks into my class. She has an amazing tattoo right here of a sea otter. Sea otters are notoriously playful. Most people would say that the sea otter is probably the most playful animal that you can get. So she walks into class. I ask, as I usually would do, why do you want to take this class? It's a class on play. Play is not often taught in divinity schools, but it's taught in mine. So why did you take this class? And she said, because my spirit longs to be as playful as the sea otter. She has deep spiritual connections. She's got a lot of ink on her arms and on her body, lots of ink. There's a deep spiritual connection between that ink when I just thought it's a beautiful sea otter that somebody inked on her arm. Deep, deep spirituality. Millennials embrace accountability. Now, it is true that that accountability is often an outward accountability, more so than an inward accountability. That can be true for some millennials. But for instance, I read in the New York Times this weekend that a group of 12 and 14-year-olds that came together out of Denver, Colorado, and San Francisco came together and they took the Trump administration to court because they said your policies of trying to reawaken coal mining and coal plants, your administration that is diminishing the guidelines for emissions, car emissions, things like that. You are ruining our future. And they took the President of the United States to court. Of course, the government immediately said, this is just bull, let's move on to something else. And the 12 and 14-year-olds appealed to a higher court who sustained their appeal. Young people want to see accountability in the world. Structures of hierarchy are notoriously bad at accountability. We can tap into accountability, and I'll return to accountability as we interpret it through the lens of Joel in the next session. The last one I've already said in many forms already. And this is it, that millennials want to change the world in which you and I live. And that change is almost always to the side of a social just world, a world that's ecologically minded, a world you can only do by, or create rather, by being an activist of sorts. You have to be in the streets. You have to say, we don't want this, we want that. You have to be out there and say, let's get rid of all the garbage that is in our neighborhood. Deeply struck, I've had the chance, my family flew in, and we went sort of on a road trip from here through the R62 to Oudtshoorn, and then we jumped across to Nyasa and came back the coastal route. Just amazed at how much, despite the lack of plastic bags, how much junk lies around everywhere we went. So, those are some very key traits about millennials. Now I'm going to ask you to take a little bit of a leap with me, okay? Bracket what I have just said as we move to something else. If it is true, which I believe it is, and statistics backs us up, that millennials do not find themselves growing up in church and faith communities, what we can say for the vast majority of them is that they don't have Christian stories to live by. They don't have that. But what we do know from sociology and anthropology, and even now from neuroscience, is that you and I live by stories. We live by stories where we can find ourselves in that narrative. Douglas Rushkoff is a media theorist, and he says one of the biggest detriments of technology is that technology is so, if we live in a Twitterverse, for instance, it's moment by moment, and you jump in and you jump out. But the one moment is not connected to the next moment. What happens is we lose our narrative existence. And so if we look at what narratives do for us, narratives give us this storyline, and we have to find ourselves within that storyline. Now, people like Kyle and Lindsay, people like RJ, they all have stories to live into. Their story is, there was a person, Lindsay's story, for instance, would be, there was a person who was homeless and lived on the streets of Nashville, and the person was cold, and the person was hungry, and somebody showed up and gave food and gave blankets, and the person's life was better after the visit. And she lives into that story every day. RJ's story is, there was a transgendered youth. The youth was bullied at school and contemplated suicide. Then the youth befriended somebody and said, there are other options. You don't have to hurt yourself in this way. And together they try to find a way of what does it mean to be transgendered in this world. We all live by stories. The challenge is that if culture gives us our stories, it will be something like, get a good education. Get a good education. Or be as wealthy as you can be. Be as wealthy as you can be. Then you have arrived. Or something like that. Culture gives us stories too. But those stories are never life-giving. So what I argue is that if we want to help the millennial generation, we have to help put them into a storyline of some sorts that take into account the very things we have discovered about this younger generation of ours. We have to put them in a storyline, and I've already said that I think the story they have to discover is the story we know in Joel, the book of Joel. It's not the Jesus story. It's the Joel story. And hopefully I'll be able to convince you that that is actually true. But what's amazing about narratives is that narratives invite us into a space. It kind of holds us that when things happen, we can orient ourselves anew, because between me and the story, there's a back and forth. There's a back and forth. There's a reason why Jesus used parables, stories, to invite people into a different world. Stories, then again, would be a far cry from statements of faith. A statement of faith is not a story. At best, it can be a moment in a story. But you cannot live by moments. It doesn't work like that. My concern is that the majority of people in the US today do not have a life-giving story to live in. So my government is pushing the story, make America great again. That's the story that they're pushing. And they're pushing it in all kinds of ways. They push sub-stories, like the immigrant is the rapist, is the gang member. We don't want immigrants. All kinds of stories are being pushed, but none of those are life-giving stories. Actually, they are filled with hostility. They bring divisiveness, and they bring change that will undo the very community building that we long for in so many ways. So if we believe the fact that we actually live by stories, then you and I, as leaders in the church, have to make a subtle switch. Now, this switch may be a little bit controversial, but I think it's the one that we need to take. And the switch is we have to move away from trying to give people the good news, and we have to help them discover the good life. Millennials have taught us that. They are not interested in the good news. And if the good news is you are a sinner, that's where you begin, and you need salvation, and Jesus is the Savior, and after you've been saved, you become part of the ecclesia, the body. Good luck bringing that to a generation that has been sexually active for a long time by the time that you bring in that message. You cannot make the entry point sin, which for Christianity is often tied. And then, of course, we will wrap it, but it's actually grace. I'm not talking about sin. I'm talking about grace, or I'm talking about God's love. But actually, we're just talking about sin. You're a bad person in need of some kind of a salvation. The good life is extremely powerful, because the good life, as I read the Gospels, I think that's what Jesus was all about, actually. That he tried to bring the good life to people. So somewhere we as faith communities have to undo years and millennia of theologies that's built upon good news. and seeing ourselves as the bearers of good news. And we have to begin to see ourselves as the facilitators of the good life. To facilitate the good life is qualitatively different from bringing good news. We will unpack that, especially in the next session. And so I think the good life takes a certain shape. The good life we can identify in some ways. And the first thing that I would lift up is that the good life implies that you and I have to find a way to flourish in the midst of loss and trauma and pain. We have to find a way to flourish in the midst of our loss, trauma, and pain. That means that you and I have to engage in some really difficult conversations with people. And it's conversations about what does flourishing look like for you? What does it look like? What keeps you from flourishing? In my context, what keeps people from flourishing is often the lack of community. You cannot flourish if there's nobody around you. You cannot flourish if you don't have a community, maybe like Jules' community of just eating together on a very regular basis. You cannot flourish in those worlds. So it begins with human flourishing. That's how we see the good life. The second one goes hand in hand, and that is that it is about building community and communities. And now I imagine a very diverse communities, the kind of community of a Lindsay that she builds under the hangover of a bridge that is the permanent home for homeless people. Alternative communities you find. We recognize the good life in the nurturing of one's spirituality. Spirituality really boils down to, do you find purpose and meaning in life that is beyond just you? It's attached to things like awe and wonder. It's attached to things like mystery. It's certainly, we will say in a few minutes, it's attached to practices, certain practices. And millennials are actually really good at that. It is about a boundaried, accountable life. You and I cannot live in a way where we always want to expand and we're ever expanding with no limits. That's the problem with capitalism, isn't it? That it's always just the rich can get richer and that can just keep growing and growing and growing. But then they kindly forget that middle class is getting eroded, the poor are getting poorer as the middle class join the poor. And that's the world in which I live in the US. I imagine that's your world here too. But we have to be accountable. We have to be accountable to each other. We have to be accountable to communities and societies. We have to be accountable to the earth. We have to be accountable to God, of course. That's part of the good life. We know when children grow up and parents do not set boundaries, as simple as you go to bed at 7 p.m. because you are 2 years old, or 8 p.m., whatever you choose, but a certain boundary of going to bed, a certain boundary of getting up. If parents don't do that, kids will go haywire. We need boundaries to absolutely survive. And then the last trait of the good life is that you make a positive contribution to this world. You make a positive contribution to this world. Now, if you've listened carefully, the good life that I have depicted follows very closely the millennial traits that I mentioned earlier. Line by line, it actually does. Now you would think that the good life that I give there is either a story or a picture, an image that was just drafted according to what we know about millennials. Or maybe it's just my own inclination to end up with, this is the good life. When we come back after tea, I will show you that what you see there is the story of the book of Joel summarized. This is a biblical image of the good life. It has nothing to do with millennials, actually, because the book of Joel is about 2,500 years old. And if we can invite millennials, definitely, but actually all people of all ages, if we can invite them into the good life, I have every confidence that the church will thrive. I have every confidence that societies will look different. I have every belief that the earth will groan less as we mess her up. And we do that because we live according to the good life.